I've got Richard Pitman on the line. Good evening, Richard.
Peter, good evening.
It's in relation to, obviously, some of the stories that you have, and we've just seen the clip of the 1967 Gold Cup, but obviously you've got one or two really good stories to tell us.
Yes. I mean, Terry was amazing because even though there'd been some great jockeys before him, he changed the mould. You know, he came along, farmer's son, very countrified, great big blonde god he was. Everyone loved him, from the stewards to the public, the other jocks, and he rode through life in a cavalier fashion. It was just marvellous. But, you know, there's a piece going out around, John Frankham found it on Pathé News from the late 60s, I suppose it was, and he was a big boy. He always had a lot of weight problem, and he had his own sweatbox at the farm, in the tack room there. It was a little handmade one, made for Charlie Smirk, the flat jockey, so it was tiny. And it was lit up by 24 high-voltage bulbs. And it was just like a fridge. And he squeezed himself in there and just fried himself for an hour. He weighed, the Pathé News weighed him before he got in, and he just sweat buckets. And when he got out an hour later, they weighed him again, and he'd lost 7 pounds in just body fluid. But it didn't affect his riding or himself. He was just so full of it. You know, he was larger than life.
When was the first time you met Terry? I mean, obviously there was a story in the recent press as well about the Hereford, your first winner.
Yeah, first winner that wasn't. In those days, of course, there were no cameras. There was a head-on steward's box to see you coming up the straight, where someone looked at you through binoculars, and there were many more objections to winners in those days. And the biggest storyteller got the race, and of course, people loved Terry. You know, he was so popular. And when we went in, I mean, I won quite nicely on this thing. Never ridden a winner in 60 races, and he'd ridden hundreds of winners. And when we went into the steward's room, I said to him on the way in while we were waiting, you know, what on earth have you objected for? And he said, well, if you don't try, you don't get, you see. And I said, well, don't be stupid. He said, no, come on. Anyway, in we went. And I knew straight away I was going to lose it, even though I'd done nothing wrong, because they loved him. They all kept saying, now, Terry, what have you got to say? And then they'd turn around and say, Pitman, what do you think? Well, you know, Terry one hand, Pitman the other. There was only going to be one result. As we went out, he put his arm around me, gave me a hug and said, it was worth a try, wasn't it? I mean, he was just an amazing fellow.
And in terms of his riding, obviously he's 3 times jumps champion as well. I mean, he must have been very hard to beat in a finish, I would imagine. He
was very strong, but amazingly, Peter, and you wouldn't get away with it these days, he could never use his whip in his left hand, you know. He had a very stylish finish and very strong. He would gather the reins up very short, and his hand would be on top of the horse's neck by their ears, pushing their head down. With each stride, as his legs went back, his hand would go down to push their head down, to get them to elongate their stride by even just a fraction, which makes the difference of a short head. And very strong with his right arm, but stylish, good, tactically great. But just one of those, I mean, we were both the same age, but, you know, he was a man and I was a boy. And you could never get him home. You know, I mean, we'd come back from Folkestone by train via London. Well, we'd never get past Jermyn Street. I think it was Harry's Bar we always headed for. And I was pretty wet and under the thumb and always wanted to get home. And anyway, it would go on the night, you know, and eventually we'd end up in the Turkish baths in Jermyn Street. A, because it was the cheapest bed in London, £1 10 shillings for the night, and B, you could sweat off the excesses of being in Harry's Bar, and then C, he'd go off to wherever he was riding the next day, and I'd go home for a rollicking.
Well, you couldn't get away with that now, that's for sure, Richard. And obviously we can't let you go, obviously speaking about Terry in relation to Henrietta Knight and Best Mate and Edred on Blur, two fabulous horses.
Yes. And there was another very good one of Jim Lewis's called Impec, who was a very, very good horse. Now, Hen is a good trainer, and, I mean, they were called the odd couple in racing, and I suppose they were. She was almost aristocratic, you know. I mean, she would have dined at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, and the Queen would have been to her a lot of times. she was and is a very knowledgeable person. You know, she was chairman of the selectors for the British three-day event team for years. You know, she's a very, very astute and good, brilliant horse person. And of course now she is, I suppose, assistant trainer to Mick Shannon, where her horses went when they gave up, you see. So she's still involved.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much indeed to taking your time out there, and some wonderful memories, and hopefully on a lighter note we can get you on talk about your career as well at some point.
Oh, that's very forgettable.
You take care. Thanks very much.
Bye.